AAA studios spend tons of time and effort trying to perfect their UX or user experience. They have tons of resources to be able to get everything just right. Because when it's smoother to play a game, players are more likely to keep playing the game, which is what most developers want players to do with their games. But if you're an indie dev, how do you get to test for that perfect AAA UX experience? Well, the great thing about the indie space is that, we have that sharing of knowledge, right? But if you wanted to get knowledge from AAA folks, how would you do that? And you can't just like knock on the door of a UX designer at PlayStation and say like, "Hey, can you give me some UX advice?" That's actually a bad example because the next speaker is a UX designer from PlayStation here to give advice. But if you wanted advice from another AAA, well, this particular speaker would suggest that you just steal it. Our next speaker is here to help us conduct a UX heist. Ava Liao got started working with UX is Fine on Valorant before she made her move over to PlayStation. Today, she's going to help us figure out how to lift, ethically, some great ideas on enhancing the user experience in our games. Please welcome to the stage, Ava Liao.
Hi, I'm Ava. I'm currently a UX designer at PlayStation. Before PlayStation, I worked as a contract designer at UX is Fine, where I worked on Valorant for Riot Games. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about user experience in games. If you've ever heard about UX but aren't quite sure what it is and how it might fit with your existing processes in game development, this is for you. So today, we're going to be pulling off a bit of a heist. Just for this talk, we're going to be art, or more appropriately, design thieves. So like any good heist, we need a plan. A good heist crew needs to know the stakes. What's in it for us? What even is UX? And what's the point of good UX? We also need to scope out the targets. Where and how do you find examples of good UX? And lastly, but definitely not least, we'll execute the operation. I'll cover 3 core UX principles with case studies and identify what makes each so effective. It's probably easier than you think to break these patterns down and implement them into your own games and projects. So let's get into it. What is UX, or user experience? Why should you care about improving the UX of your game? Well, let's start with the definition. User experience encompasses all aspects of the player's interaction with the game. It's not just making the UI. Let's talk a bit then about the player journey. What do you think the first stage is? Maybe it's launching the game. Well, that's not necessarily entirely true. Let's put it in the third phase for now. The player's experience, to me, actually starts from before the player begins playing the game. It might start with them thinking about wanting to play something, then turning on their PC or console or phone, plugging in their earbuds or turning on their speakers, and then launching. The player's physical environment is oftentimes just as important to consider as their digital environment, especially if you're factoring in accessibility. So what does the holistic view of this journey look like once the player has thought about starting, set everything up, and launched? The vast majority of what actually takes place in-game is in this arrow. It's up to you to make that arrow extend for as long or as short as you want it to. You don't have to be a UX designer to think like a UX designer. In fact, it's incredibly similar, if not intersecting, with game design. I'm sure you can think of a time where you've played a game and felt frustrated. Perhaps you haven't played a game in a long while and you've completely forgotten what certain icons mean. Or maybe there was a menu or inventory that you had to frequently access, but it took an annoying number of clicks to get there. If you've ever played a Souls-like game, imagine the run back to the boss taking up half the map. You definitely want to avoid experiences like that. All of these little things add up. The more of these little obstacles you encounter, the more likely it is that you quit out of the game earlier. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. At the heart of it, good UX makes the game more fun for the player by making it easier for them to access the things they need and keeping them in the flow that they want. So now that we have a better idea of the stakes, let's talk a bit about the targets. Where do you find examples of successful game UX? Well, let's start by working backwards. If, for example, you're looking to create a successful onboarding experience, think about what kind of incentives are at play. I'm talking about business motivations more broadly. What kind of games rely on high adoptability? Well, free-to-play games, gachas, and mobile games need to be easy to get into, and the only way to do that is if people make it through the first-time user experience. That's a lot of money spent on UX research and analysis to ensure that the onboarding process is as smooth as possible. There's a reason why there are a certain number of steps or certain elements. You can reverse engineer them for free. Alternatively, if you want an optimized heads-up display, it's worth looking at fast-paced multiplayer games with a large user base. What elements do they prioritize? Why do they make some areas more flashy than others? It's important to look for a specific part of the game. Make sure you're referencing specific decisions rather than copy-pasting the entirety of the UI. You don't have to agree with their choices, but it's definitely worth thinking about why they are that way. This also makes UX patterns more adaptable to your specific situation. Rather than thinking, oh, Overwatch has a flashing ult animation, so I should have one too, think about it like Overwatch has a flashing ult animation because ults are incredibly important and have significant consequences to core gameplay. Is there an element on my screen that needs that level of attention? And if so, what? What core elements of my gameplay are important and should be represented as such in my HUD? So let's get to the juicy stuff, the operation. We're going to look at 3 core UX principles: cognitive load, pathfinding, and immersion, and I'll walk you through why they're so effective. Obviously, there are more than 3 great UX principles you should follow. I'll have links to more resources at the end. So let's start by talking about cognitive load. In 1956, cognitive psychologist George Miller introduced the concept of limited short-term memory and chunking. Miller's law posits that the average person is actually severely limited in terms of the amount of information they can receive, process, and remember. Miller refines this limitation down to a specific number: 7 items, give or take 2. So it's been 68 years since Miller's research, and the sheer amount of information and stimuli that surrounds us day to day has increased exponentially. As such, it may be better to err on the side of 5 rather than 9. This also helps substantially when dealing with cognitive load. Things like flashy colors, unusual fonts, and text treatments add to that, and especially make it hard to know what's going on or what you should be focusing on. So, what patterns successfully spread and reduce cognitive load? Well, let's take a look at a few games. In Apex Legends, new gameplay elements are introduced to you in a way that's staggered. Right from the start, there are only 3 items on screen, as you can see here. There are also only 5 actions you're expected to perform before you can move on: move, sprint, jump, slide, and crouch, all very basic. Apex also chunks or groups which actions you're supposed to be exposed to at a time. This establishes a tangible relationship between action and location. For example, I would be more likely to press these buttons when I'm near a crate as opposed to just running around. Let's also talk about Ghost of Tsushima, which has a relatively minimal HUD. Here, you're only presented with 3 actions. They're all grouped together, so it's relatively easy to scan at a glance. Ghost of Tsushima also goes the extra mile by adding a black background, so the text is more easily readable. There's also reinforcement. You're expected to repeat the action a certain number of times before you proceed. Just like how writing notes has been proven to be more effective during learning, requiring repetition as part of onboarding helps instill muscle memory that may prove to reduce the cognitive load. Journey actually does something similar, prompting you with an overlay of your controller when teaching you a certain action. This prompt returns at different points during the early gameplay, so you'll know when best to use it. Lastly, let's take a look at Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which combines all of these concepts. Again, only 3 items on screen. It has a limited number of actions, forced repetition, and easily visible text. You can only attack with a lightsaber or press to use the force attack. The visual feedback from you taking those actions is a nice touch of polish on top. Jedi Survivor also takes this even further by having a training ground accessible from the menu present at any meditation point. So say, for example, you quit out and don't play for a month. When you're back, you're able to access this area to refresh your memory so you feel much less disoriented. Genshin Impact also does something similar with its tutorial and archive hub, where you can search up not only core combat actions, but also gameplay and puzzle mechanics. To recap this first idea, be mindful of cognitive load. Stagger new concepts and group them in ways that will make it easy for the player to remember. Reinforce these new concepts through repetition and reminders. Make sure that there's no more than 5 or at a stretch 7 items on screen at a time. If you can, give players a place where they can refer back to these concepts or practice in safe area. It's much more reassuring if you accidentally skip through something to know that there's somewhere you can catch up. Next, let's talk about pathfinding. How easy is it for your player to get to the thing they need? And do they know what to look for in the first place? Think of pathfinding like level design, but for your interface. Sometimes players need that yellow paint to not only know where to go, but as a distinct indicator of what to look for. It's always good practice to block it out first, and then gradually add layers of fidelity, just like level design. So what do Disco Elysium, the League of Legends client, and Genshin Impact all have in common? Well, they all make use of notification badges. It's a tried and tested pattern across software. Introducing it into your game as a way to signify something new, whether that's a newly acquired inventory item or some kind of change in the background, is a surefire way of attracting the player's attention. Maybe you're locked into your current game activity and don't have time to respond to whatever's going on. Notification badges serve as a clear flag of where to go next. Disco Elysium takes this a bit further. The little halo surrounding Harry's head throughout the game when you enter detective mode highlights all interactable objects with these little green orbs as a way to nudge the player in the right direction. It's important to note that this mode can be toggled on or off to preserve immersion. Destiny 2 gives us another way of directing the player's attention with these accented underlined hints on the side of the screen. It also makes use of the Gestalt principles of proximity and similarity to establish relation and hierarchy. In this character inspection screen, I can tell at a glance which submenu I'm in, since they're all grouped together on the top right. I also know how to navigate from character to journey thanks to the key symbols on the far left and right, A and D. There's also other, little more subtle hints with the navigation. You can see here on the left and the right of the screen that there are icons representing journey and inventory also. Let's also talk about pathfinding within the HUD. Are the elements that you're going to be interacting with most in positions that make sense? You'll probably already have noticed that most HUDs and interfaces in general focus their core elements around the corners and edges of the screen, rather than taking up the center. It's obvious why. You don't want to obstruct the actual gameplay and what's going on, but let's also think about the relative positioning. How far does the player's cursor, mouse, or hand have to travel to get to each on-screen element? The further it needs to go, the more friction there will be, and the less accessible it will likely be. Are there perhaps shortcuts that could circumvent this friction entirely, like the keyboard shortcuts in Genshin Impact or Destiny, or even the utility wheel in Apex Legends? Darkest Dungeon is a more extreme example of HUD positioning that succeeds. The overwhelming majority of actions and interactable elements, with the exception of the torch brightness, are in the bottom half of the screen. Even if you haven't played the game, you can tell from a glance that the macro element, that is, map location, is on the right half, while the more micro elements, individual characters and actions, are on the left half. Your brain can then make the deduction that most of your playtime will be spent focusing on the left half, where everything is conveniently grouped. Your mouse doesn't have to move across the entire screen to reach the next most reasonable action or button. It saves you time and keeps you in the flow. So to quickly recap pathfinding, treat interface design similarly to level design. Add indicators or accents when needed to emphasize key state changes or to draw attention. Group all relevant actions together to minimize friction. Consider the value of shortcuts as a faster and more accessible alternative. And clicking on notifications should always take you directly to the relevant screen. Lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about immersion and the potential of diegetic interfaces. The point of this talk isn't to tell you that you should be adding more interfaces into your games. Great UX doesn't necessarily mean an abundance of UI. You've probably seen this meme floating around at some point. Rather, the point is to encourage you to think about what your game and your players might need. Unpacking does a great job of this. Instead of adding an item counter or a checklist to the interface while the player is unpacking, they focus on subtractive design, in which all extraneous elements are removed to strengthen the core. This game could also have added those red outlines during the process of placing, but instead the game preserves your flow. The only indicators that you need to change something are left until you've completely removed everything from the packing boxes. There's also a cheat code you should be aware of. The aesthetic usability effect means that even if the interface is less usable, if it's more aesthetically pleasing, then people will think of it as more usable. A good way to do this is by bringing narrative or world building into the interface if possible, making it diegetic. Perhaps text prompts and notifications are styled in the likeness of government documents of that game's world. Maybe they're gigantic rune slabs etched with ancient Jedi texts. Or maybe it's a ship log being used by an investigator. Alternatively, maybe it's not even an interface at all. Maybe it's something like the guiding wind in Ghost of Tsushima. The sky really is the limit here. So we pulled off a bit of a heist today. Let's do a quick recap of what we've taken. Cognitive load, pathfinding, immersion, but above all, testing. Your UX is only good if you can prove it's good. Don't underestimate the power of cheap and fast prototyping. Faking it using gray boxes in Figma can yield more insights and save more money than a fully built in-engine render. Make sure to go out there and test on strangers, not just your friends and family. So now, with all of these covered, I'd like to say that this mission is complete. Good UX doesn't have to be costly, difficult, or full of UI. It's more than possible to learn from all of these successful patterns you see in other games and integrate them into your own. Thank you for watching.
That was an incredible talk, Ava. Thank you. And such killer slide design. So impressed. The thing that's really cool about learning these core concepts, these things like immersion, pathfinding, cognitive load, you can recognize them all over the place and not just in games. Being able to make some of those connections, to see little signposts and things that you like, or to recognize the ways that you don't like them in other places, it helps you take these puzzle pieces and fit them in your game in a way that can be really unique and wonderful. So thank you for giving us those components. Also, thank you for choosing Warlock in Destiny 2. I did notice, and that is the correct answer. Thank you everybody for watching. Ava, thank you so much for your talk. If you would like to keep up with Ava, please find her on her website, avaliao.com. Now, we're going to take our next break. After we come back, we're going to have our final dev interview. This time with a game that we've heard mentioned a couple times over the course of the show. One about a young boy grieving the loss of his father, and a man grieving the loss of his father as well. We'll see you when we get back.